Cool. Okay, I think we can get started. Hi again, everyone. It's good to be here today. I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Hamdi, the co-founder and CEO of Abwaab. Abwaab is an edtech startup based out of the MENA P region, helping students get ahead in school instead of depend heavily on after-school tutoring. And I think with this we can start. Today, hopefully I'll be able to add a thing or two to everyone listening on user acquisition, launch, and growth. And while we go through this, if you have any questions, please just drop them in the comment section. We'll make sure to have a Q&A session at the end to tackle all of the points. Okay, let me just start. Okay. So I think I'll just start with a quick introduction about myself first. As I said, I'm one of the co-founders of Abwaab. We launched right before the pandemic in February of 2020 and been growing since. Today operating in Jordan, Egypt, Pakistan, Iraq, and KSA. I started my career in 2009 when I graduated from both King's and LSE to do my master's. At the time, it was the credit crunch happening. Financial crisis was going on. It was just very difficult to find a job where I wanted to go into the financial industry. And I started my first company called Dukkan in 2009, and that ran for around 6 years. Initially, it was a series of failures, I would say, just like continuous slaps in the face. But I've learned a lot. And then in 2015, I joined Uber. When Uber was launching, I didn't believe that a ride-sharing service would make it in this part of the world, but I ended up joining, and very soon Uber was everything I was eating, living, and breathing for 5 years. Where 1 year in, I actually ended up exiting from my company. And throughout my time at Uber, I just saw how much impact you can have on mobility through technology, and I realized that if you can have that much impact on mobility through tech, imagine what you can do on education. And from there, the Abwaab idea started. Today, we're going to talk about questions to ask when scaling and launching in new markets. I think we can start by thinking of it in a way where there are 3 scenarios in this situation. You're either a founder or an early joiner in a startup launching your first market ever from scratch. Or you are already operating, but you've launched your first market and you want to launch your second or third expansion market. Or you're pure in scaling, in growth stage. And I think the way you need to think about them varies a lot, depending on the context. And we're going to talk about this a bit more today. So let's just start with what to ask in the first or second scenario where you're either launching your first market or doing your first expansion. I think the first important thing is to think of who are the current players. How does the dynamic look like? Who is present in the market? How big are the competitors? How long have they been running for? And when you think of it in that lens, I think it can be broken down into also 3 types of competitors if you're launching a tech startup. It could either be the incumbent or the incumbent that tried to go into technology, or it could be the third where it's a pure tech startup that you're competing against. And we're going to talk about this in a bit, and I'll give you some examples. So I'll give an example to start off with from the ride-sharing industry, given my 5 years of experience in that field. Now, when Uber wanted to launch in a market, the clear direct rival would be the incumbent, which is the taxi service at the time. Alternatively, there are other companies that used to operate as taxi companies, but then decided to adopt technology and launch their own apps. And that type of competitor is very different than just competing directly with the offline service. And then there's tech startups, so Uber, and there are all the likes of Kareem in the region, Didi, Yandex, and everyone else. And when you come to think of it in that lens, you would understand that the strengths and weaknesses of these 3 different types of competitors are extremely different. And I'm going to give another example. So here's an example on the Edtech space. So right now, as Abwaab, if we want to look at the industry, there would be three types of competitors. The incumbent would be private tutoring centers, which is extremely prevalent in this part of the world, and students are already used to be going there. And then there's the incumbent with technology. So a lot of these after-school tutoring centers realize that the importance of tech and going online, and many of these actually created websites where they started hosting the videos, creating videos of the lessons that they're providing in these centers, and just putting them up on a website. And then there's actual edtech startups that already started from scratch for the purpose of like Abwaab, for the purpose of delivering an educational solution online. And again, when you think of the strengths and weaknesses of these three different types of players, it helps you know how to position yourself as you enter the market and as you clarify your unique selling points as opposed to these competing players. So if we want to think about it of, okay, how do I approach the market? How do I start? Again, first things first is you look at these players. So I'm going to give further context. So let's assume we're looking at the edtech space. After school tutoring centers, probably their strengths are they have a good reputation, they have a strong loyal base of students, they're known by parents, they've been running for years. So this is definitely a strength that they have. But if you come to think of their weaknesses, when we look at it as a startup like Abwaab, they're probably extremely expensive. You can't you can't access it at any time you want. It's probably much more affordable to do the service online. You probably can't get assessed and get your results immediately. You can't track your progress. You can't check in with your friends at any point in time during the night. And then when you start understanding these unique selling points, it helps you, one, craft your product, and two, know how to market it, take it to the market. And this, of course, I'm already keeping in mind that you're launching a market through a greenfield investment. So obviously there are other ways where you can launch in other markets through acquisitions, and we've actually done that in Pakistan, where we acquired an existing startup that enabled us to launch much faster in Pakistan. But the examples that I'm talking about are more relevant to you going to plant the first seed from scratch in a market. Cool. And then you need to build your go-to-market strategy. And depending on what stage you're at, if it's your first time you're launching, you need to be on the ground. You need to just be as close to the students as possible. Sorry, students or users in any case, and just to understand what their pain points are. How can you add value to them, and how can you really make their lives better? One could imagine that in the world of tech, everything needs to be done online. So I'm a tech startup, I just need to be running Google ads and search words and paid ads and performance marketing and all of that. Where in reality, the power of understanding what the user wants and taking the product to the users lies in seeing the users themselves. And again, first you need to think of who is the typical user, because if you think of who the typical user is in the lens of products, you could be offering them one of three things. You're either giving them a vegetable, which is nice to have, or you could be giving them a vitamin, which is a bit more important, or you could be giving them a painkiller. And obviously, this varies in how important this would be to the user. And once you understand that your service is actually giving them a painkiller rather than a nice-to-have vegetable, and you start tweaking around that and you start iterating, I think it would take you a very long way. And as I said, it's extremely important to just be continuously sitting with users or students and hearing their feedback, doing usability testing, seeing how they interact with the product. And when you do that, you start understanding what the current challenges of these users are, and is your service that you're doing making it better or not? So let's assume I'm providing an online learning solution. do my classes that I offer online explain better? Am I able to access them at any point that I want? Can I go over them over and over again? Regardless what it is, it's extremely important to understand that if your service or product is actually making the user's life better. What's even more important is, can they live without your service at all? And you can do that by running a lot of surveys and focus groups with your users to understand and actually ask them this question explicitly. If my service were to drop today or completely stop, how would you feel? Would you be satisfied? Would you be extremely dissatisfied? And so on and so forth. And this would help you build further your product. If we want to give context on learning, you can start asking questions. How do they study? When do they do it? Do they do it at night? Do they do it in the morning? Do they solve past papers? Do they want to take lessons over and over again? Do they want to collaborate as groups or study alone? Do they want to socialize? Do they want to review through study notes? I mean, these are all questions that are important to ask yourself, so that you understand what is the value in the product that you're offering. And once you know that, it makes it much easier to start taking it to the market and marketing it under these unique selling points. And if you understand that, this will start driving virality and organic growth on its own, because at that point you would have created brand ambassadors to your users that actually start talking about it. And from there, you just keep on iterating and iterating over again. I think I've already talked about this, but grassroots efforts is something that's extremely important to do. So if you're in the ride-sharing industry, you need to go to a place where business clusters or centers employees are about to leave, and you just need to figure out what modes of transportation are they actually using to leave, and if offering a ride-sharing service would make it better. If you're in the Edtech space, you probably want to go to a school when students are leaving in the afternoon, or where they're going to the after-school tutoring centers, stand right there, speak to students, understand their pain points and what they want to do. And then, of course, comes the scaling part. And when we think about scaling, you need to think of it in a way of, okay, am I creating a snowball? How difficult is it in the beginning to start pushing the snowball? Because obviously in the beginning, you just need to keep on giving it momentum and pushing it until it gets to a point where it's just completely running on its own, and you're actually playing catch up with it. And when you hit that point, you know that you're at the point of scaling continuously. And over there, you need to start thinking of the questions you need to ask yourself of, okay, what is my defensibility tactic? If today I'm at a scaling point, what makes me defensible from other players coming into the market and entering and competing with me? Is it price? So am I very competitively priced? Does this price pave the way for good unit economics for like long-term sustainable profitability? Because we all know that we're not here to build products that are because I mean, in the tech space, startups tend to significantly cut down the price in the beginning in the effort to penetrate the market, which could be a very good strategy. But will that be sustainable on the long term or not? Am I building a good brand? Is my defensibility tactic a brand that now everyone loves and everyone is attached to and they've started to resonate with it a lot? Have I created brand ambassadors? Are my students or users just continuously promoting my product on my behalf because they're so in love with it? And if that's the case, am I at a point where I'm just playing catch up with demand? And if this is the case, I need to figure out my supply strategy. Because if you reach a point where the snowball is just running aggressively, you need to understand that there needs to be a robust supply mechanism that allows you to keep on catching up with demand in order to scale. And I think I would summarize it with two things if you're at a scaling point. One is you need to have a product that your users love, and you need to have validated that through PMF and everything else. And second is you need to understand that do you have the supply needed in order to scale? I think that kind of summarizes it. I hope this was helpful for everyone on the call. we can move on to Q&A at this point with Asad.
Thank you for that, Hamdi. That was some really insightful stuff over there. I really loved how you talked about the incumbent model and then the incumbent branching into tech and then the pure techs. And I specifically really enjoyed the one about the vegetable, vitamin, and painkiller. It's always a nice contrast when it's a battle between the nice to haves versus making a product a necessity. So people they just don't want to have a reason not to say no. So that was really, really good. Thank you for those insights.
Thank you.
And just to jump into some of the questions then that have come in from the audience, let's take a look at some of these. I think there might be a few curveballs coming your way. So to kick it off, let's start with the first one being, when it comes to launching in new markets, what kind of time frame should a startup look at when deciding to establish itself?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And look, this is much more of an art than a science. It's extremely difficult to know when the right timing is. Sometimes stars align and you end up doing that. So for example, when we launched our first, we weren't planning to expand geographically as fast. Our first launch was Egypt outside of Jordan. All the opportunities came together. We got our hands on a very strong team. COVID was happening and students needed an online service. Our product was starting to get ready to be able to roll it out. And we just thought that this is an opportunity that we cannot miss because that team is not going to be around if we wait much longer. So we decided to do it. I think it's really on a case-by-case basis. You need to assess the size of the opportunity, your readiness to do that, if it's the right time or not. If you'll spread yourself too thin, or you'll still be able to carry your own weight and do it.
Awesome. And we were talking a lot about tech, and I remember you made a lot of references to Uber and how you can adopt tech and then take that into the education space, for example. So another one that comes to mind is, when do you know it's the right time to go live with your application when you're a tech startup?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We always go by the saying, I just love it, by Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, quote that we're actually on LinkedIn right now. He said, almost word for word, if you're not embarrassed to launch your product to the market, you're launching too late. Because you could always lock yourself in a room for 2 years trying to perfect the best product out there and then launch it. But little do we know about what the market really wants and what the user ahead of you is actually looking for or expecting to make their life better. So the philosophy that we take at Abwaab is build an MVP, take it at its earliest stage as possible, even if you take it to like a small segment of users, get their feedback, iterate on it, and then get their feedback again. And this applies to the actual full product, but also on features inside the product. So for example, today on Abwaab, you can take a snapshot of a question that you're having challenges with and get connected with a tutor instantly with like 10 seconds, within 10 seconds. We launched that service very early on when we built the MVP. And now we're just continuously iterating on it, adding more features to just make the whole experience much better. So I think that would be my answer.
It's interesting because we've also had founders cite the example about not the embarrassment when it comes to MVP. So it's definitely a very strong theme that resonates with startup founders, which is great to see. Yeah. Another interesting one that's come through is, let's say that you have a great product or a service offering in the market, but for that product or offering, what would you say is the biggest hurdle in improving its monetization and its user base?
I think so if I get your question correctly, you're asking of what hurdles are there to monetize your product? Is that what you're asking, Asad?
Yeah.
Look, bottom line is the user needs to see value in it. It's very difficult to understand that without experimenting. The way we do things is we just run continuous experiments on monetization from very, very, very early on to just gauge what the best package to sell is, what is the best price point. Because, I mean, monetization is a world of its own. You could be selling the whole thing. You could be upselling. You could be running a freemium subscription. You could have different price points for different products. You could bundle everything together. I think the best way to do it is definitely run experiments and just get feedback from the user ahead of you. Obviously, that's on top of all the market research that everyone's expected to do to understand what the pricing in the market is.
Awesome. And we've talked about some of the more upbeat things regarding launching in the market. A slight end change in the spectrum here. So at what point should a startup decide to walk away from a new market if it's not achieving its intended objective? Like, at what point does it draw the line and say, okay, it didn't work out, we should exit?
Very, very, very difficult question. Look, you would never know. There are two schools of thought. There's one school of thought that says, I'm just going to keep on being persistent and at some point I'm going to crack it. The other school of thought is, listen, this is just not going to work. Let me shut down this market and jump to another one. I think you need to contextualize things when you think of it that way, and try to compare it with potentially other markets that you're already running. So if the demographics are extremely similar between two markets, let's say you have one market A is extremely successful, market B is not that successful, but the demographics are very similar, the dynamics are similar, regulatory system is the same, more or less, there would be something that's missing that requires you to crack it. And sometimes you need to actually wait it out. So back at the time when I was managing a few markets at Uber, one of the markets really took a lot of time to crack. And when it did, it just like went up as a hockey stick. Other markets, however, sometimes just have fundamental challenges that if you really deep dive into, you realize that this is not the battle that you want to fight. It could be like a major regulatory showstopper that's not allowing you to run, or that you realize the market is just too small. It could be multiple things, and in that case, I think it's just best to pull the plug and focus the energy on other things.
Yeah, I think it ties back into what you mentioned earlier about it being an art, not a science, and it's never a one-size-fits-all approach. You could have tremendous success in one, or you might have to bide your time, so it is very interesting how it works in new markets, isn't it?
And it's just not going to be a rosy, like sometimes it looks, launching and expanding looks extremely rosy, but having this conversation is definitely not going to be an easy one. And for anyone like listening on this call, you just need to be prepared for having adverse times and having difficult conversations, and opening up and just being transparent with yourself and with everyone around you on what you think could work, what not.
100%. And if we could just go back to metrics again real quick, and specifically user acquisition channels, how do you think about and prioritize these acquisition channels at Abwaab?
So as I mentioned earlier during the talk, to me, I usually categorize all the online channels as the traditional way of doing things, because it kind of became traditional for tech startups to say, I'm just gonna go and start spending online through performance marketing channels, etc. And for that, obviously, you need to be monitoring conversion, metrics, CAC, through different channels, etc. And then you need to follow through to see engagement and retention of users that come through different channels, because sometimes you might have really good conversion from a certain channel, but then they might not really end up going through your product deeply because the product wasn't too relevant for them. This is all the like traditional way of things. The other non-traditional approach is running on the ground and trying to acquire your users through offline experiences, and setting KPIs for these initiatives is much more difficult because it's not entirely within your control. And you need to just think creatively of what metrics can you use to reflect these efforts. So it could be number of interactions these agents on the ground or ambassadors are having. You could come up with like referral codes for them to see how these are converting. But definitely these are the two methods that I would do, and obviously look at in terms of metrics differently.
Awesome. And just to summarize the session very beautifully into one way, you've mentioned a lot of things in your presentation and in the Q&A part. But if there was to be one major mistake that a startup founder should avoid when trying to launch in a new market, what would you say would that mistake be? Like, you have to stay clear of this 100%.
Don't launch another market if you don't feel that you have hit PMF in the market that you're running. Because most likely, if your product works in one market, it will work in 15 or 20 or 30 markets. So definitely just focus on creating the best value for your user in the market that you're running. And once you crack that, you could just start, then becomes like a cookie cutter approach almost, where you're just like running and scaling and executing and operationalizing.
Awesome. And if we could have one more, I think it's an interesting one that's come in from the audience. We've spoken about tech adoption, and we've spoken about how tech is obviously very paramount in the day and age that we live in. But if your audience, if they're not tech friendly, how would you go about overcoming the hurdles with such an audience that are not exactly tech savvy?
Yeah, I'll take that. And I realize that there's one more question that I'd like to take as well. Look, I mean, if you're offering a tech solution, if you're building a tech product and your users are not that tech savvy, you need to think about the whole thing in the first place, because that on its own is a very big barrier to entry. And I'm not sure if this is the thing that you want to pursue. So I would assume people that are not tech savvy in this day and age are probably like extremely elderly people, or people in extremely remote areas that don't have access to technology, because otherwise access to technology is just growing more and more over time. But let's assume that you are actually doing that. I would just go and sit with the actual user and walk them through the product or the experience, and put a lot of effort into onboarding. So let's assume this is a high value service for elderly people, where if they actually end up using it, it's extremely financially rewarding for you. I would just put a lot of effort into onboarding them and bringing them up to speed, and even like assign a key account manager for this group of users, where that person checks in, make sure they're okay with utilizing the service and they have no issues with it. There's one more question. Someone's saying, but do you have the feeling that if you launch your application with a lot of bugs, the users will not understand that it's an MVP and will no longer still use your product, and at the same time you give the competitors chance to advertise you as low quality service? Look, this challenge will always exist. If you're building a product, and I have this discussion with the team a lot, if you're building a product for the millions, it's okay to get 1,000 people or 2,000 people or 50,000 people that actually extremely wowed by the service, because the insights you will get from these people will just be invaluable. Think of it this way: the first 1,000 people that used Facebook probably found it as a very basic service back in 2000, I don't know, 2003, 2004. It's an extremely different version of what. I mean, back at the time, I remember we needed to use our university email account to be able to sign up to have a Facebook account. Life has changed a lot by then, but I'm sure they just managed to drive a lot of insights from their users.
Thank you very much, Hamdi. You've been very passionate, and it's been great to tune into the insights that you shared. But judging by the audience's reaction, everyone is really highly engaged, and I'm sure they've taken a lot of learning lessons away from the session. So it's been an absolute pleasure to host you and hear from you today.
Thank you, Asad. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me over LinkedIn. I'll be happy to connect. And if there's anything I could support with, I'd love to do that. I think learning is always two-way as well.
Definitely a tune of lifelong learning. 100% agree with that. All right, we'll pass it back over to Noor to take you guys through the rest of the day.